Israel has invaded Lebanon, and reports suggest the United States has indications that Iran is preparing for an imminent ballistic missile attack on Israel in response. While Israel has chosen to term it a limited operation, fact is Israel's ground offensive in neighboring Lebanon has begun. The incursion into southern Lebanon is targeting Hezbollah strongholds, infrastructure and hideouts. Israeli officials have described the offensive as localized raids that are very limited in scope. They claim there would be no long-term occupation of Lebanon. The incursion, which Israel's Security Cabinet has called the next phase of its war with Hezbollah, marks the fourth time that Israeli soldiers have publicly entered Lebanese territory in nearly 50 years, and the first since Israel's 34-day war in the country in 2006. The escalation in the war in just the last few days has killed more than 1,000 people, destroyed homes and displaced 1 million people in Lebanon. The Israeli military says its soldiers, including paratroopers and commandos, as well as armored corps troops, had been preparing for limited localized targeted operations in southern Lebanon that began last night. They say the soldiers had gained skills and operational experience in Gaza over many months. Hezbollah has rejected claims that Israeli forces have entered southern Lebanon, describing them as lies. The Israeli military has called for residents in more than 24 villages in southern Lebanon to evacuate approximately 30 miles into the country to the north of the Al-Awali River. Their warning says anyone in close proximity to Hezbollah members or their facilities or combat equipment is putting their life at risk. Any house used by Hezbollah for military purposes is expected to be targeted. In an earlier social media post, the Israeli military spokesperson called on residents not to travel using vehicles north of the Litani River towards southern Lebanon. The Israeli military says they had informed the United Nations peacekeeping forces on Monday of their intent to undertake limited ground incursions into Lebanon. The UN has said any crossing into Lebanon is in violation of Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity and a violation of Resolution 1701. We urge all actors to step back from such escalatory acts, which will only lead to more violence and more bloodshed. Resolution 1701 is the 2006 UN Security Council resolution, which called for a permanent ceasefire and end to hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. The resolution also stipulates that Hezbollah forces must withdraw north of the Litani River in Lebanon and that only the Lebanese military should hold positions in the border area. As we said, Israel claims this is a limited operation, but not only is limited a subjective term, previous military operations initially declared by Israel to be limited have proved to be anything but that. Examples include Israel's years-long occupation of southern Lebanon that began in 1982 with the stated aim of a brief and limited mission to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization. More recently, Israel's military had declared a limited operation in Rafah in southern Gaza that has left the city in ruins. The latest escalation comes after Israel killed Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah in an airstrike on Friday and decimated the leadership of the most powerful paramilitary force in the Middle East. The Israeli military had earlier said it was focused on removing immediate threats from Lebanese villages along the border, including Hezbollah's ability to infiltrate northern Israel. While the extent of Israel's military plans inside Lebanon remain unclear, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has become increasingly defiant of international calls for restraint and de-escalation, as well as widespread outrage over growing civilian casualties in both Gaza and now Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon-based Hezbollah have been engaged in a tit-for-tat escalation since the war in Gaza began last year, following Hamas's attack on Israel. Hezbollah first attacked Israel on the 8th of October and has said it will not stop striking Israel until a ceasefire is reached in the Gaza Strip, much of which has been reduced to rubble by Israeli bombs and fighting. In recent weeks, Israel has refocused its military objectives to the north with a new war aim to return displaced residents to their homes along the Lebanon border. About 60,000 Israeli civilians have been forced from their homes by Hezbollah's rocket attacks. What has unfolded is some of the fiercest fighting between the two longtime foes since the 2006 Lebanon war, which killed more than 1,100 people in the country. Nearly 50 Israeli civilians and 121 Israeli soldiers were also killed in that war. Last month, pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah members exploded across Lebanon in a coordinated Israeli attack that killed dozens of people and maimed thousands, including women and children. Israel has also stepped up a relentless bombing campaign across Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah's infrastructure and leadership. But the strikes have also decimated homes and entire neighborhoods in densely populated areas. Massive airstrikes in capital Beirut have killed a string of Hezbollah leaders and more than 1,000 people, many of them civilians. The latest developments raise questions about how a weakened Hezbollah will respond and the extent to which its backer Iran could get involved, once more ratcheting up fears of a wider regional war. Hezbollah is part of an Iran-led alliance spanning Yemen, Syria, Gaza and Iraq that has attacked Israel and its allies since the war with Hamas began. Iran calls it the axis of resistance. In a fiery speech on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said one of the country's goals is changing the balance of power in the region and that there is no place in Iran or the Middle East that the long arm of Israel will not reach. Killing Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and wiping out the group's capabilities to launch a large-scale attack on Israel were necessary conditions to achieve that goal, he said. Israel has also ramped up attacks on multiple other fronts against other Iran-backed militants, including launching strikes targeting the Houthis in Yemen. But despite the recent Israeli strikes on its proxies, Iran has so far appeared wary of moving into direct conflict with its longtime enemy, even as their decades-long shadow war has been pushed further into the open. Many observers fear any direct Iranian retaliation could draw the United States further into the conflict. Netanyahu on Monday took public aim at Iran. In a televised speech, he told the Iranian people that Israel stands with you, directly addressing them without filters, without middlemen, as he put it. And he repeated his appeal to Iranians to reject their government. In the same attack that assassinated Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah, a senior member of Iran's powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps was also killed. In response, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that Israel faces crushing blows to come. Several countries and UN bodies have warned of the impact on civilians in Lebanon and the risk of further regional instability. The European Union has renewed its call for an immediate ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has called for the respect of international humanitarian law in all circumstances and said the sovereignty of both Israel and Lebanon has to be guaranteed. The French Foreign Minister urged Israel on Monday to refrain from any ground incursion into Lebanon and called on both sides to agree to a ceasefire. The United Arab Emirates expressed deep concern over the recent escalations, fearing its impact on regional stability, adding that the Gulf state reaffirmed its unwavering position towards the unity of Lebanon, its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The UAE has also directed an urgent $100 million relief package for the people of Lebanon. Jordan has expressed its rejection of the Israeli aggression against Lebanon. Saudi Arabia has said it stresses the need to preserve Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Qatar has expressed solidarity with Lebanon as well as readiness to provide support to the people to confront the consequences of the Israeli aggression. Turkey has condemned Israel's ground operation, calling it a violation of sovereignty and an unlawful act of occupation. The United Nations Agency for Humanitarian Emergencies has warned of the devastating impact on civilians of the escalations in Lebanon. The UN agency has urged the international community to urgently promote de-escalation and ensure that all parties respect international humanitarian law while prioritizing immediate humanitarian assistance to the affected people. As we said, limited is a subjective word. What Israel sees as a targeted and limited ground operation in southern Lebanese villages may look like a catastrophe to civilians on the ground. Limited has been used to describe incursions into Lebanon before. In 1982, Israel described its invasion of southern Lebanon as limited. What followed was a bloody 18-year occupation and many thousands of lives lost. Also, one key restraint from previous conflicts appears increasingly impotent this time around: Many analysts say the current situation also brings into sharp focus how the once mighty United States of America is increasingly powerless to rein in its ally or to influence other major belligerents in a fast worsening regional crisis. The White House says Israel has the right to defend itself, but it has also warned of the risk of mission creep in a ground operation that could ultimately broaden in scope and turn into a longer-term incursion. President Joe Biden last week unveiled a 21-day ceasefire proposal backed by other U.S. allies that was almost immediately rejected by the Israeli Prime Minister, much to the frustration and chagrin of the White House. The US is a key provider of Israel's weapons. It likely supplied the 2,000-pound bombs that were used to kill Hezbollah's leader. And while Biden and his advisors have continued to call for a diplomatic resolution, the pleas have clearly fallen on deaf ears. Israel's ground operation started just hours after President Biden called for a ceasefire. The US administration's diplomatic efforts for a ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza have often been publicly undermined by the Israeli Prime Minister. The proposal for a temporary Israel-Lebanon ceasefire is now a distant memory. The disconnect is widening as it coincides with the end game of a cliffhanger US election. Biden's room for maneuver is limited if he is to avoid exacerbating the domestic political impact of war in the Middle East, a factor Netanyahu clearly understands. The Democratic presidential nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, has largely stuck to the Biden administration line. Observers point out that the pattern of American impotency and Israeli defiance has played out repeatedly since the 7th October Hamas attacks on Israel, which prompted the Israeli pounding of Gaza and the more recent attempt to destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon. Netanyahu often acts first and consults the United States later, even when his actions are certain to buckle American diplomatic efforts and compound fears that the US will get dragged into a disastrous regional war. The US was not informed in advance, for instance, about the Israeli airstrike that killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, even though its global shockwaves were bound to be severe. This Israeli approach has often made the Biden administration appear like a spectator rather than an active player in events, as should befit a superpower. Months of grueling shuttle diplomacy by Secretary of State Antony Blinken have mostly drawn a blank, and the US has incessantly pushed for a Gaza ceasefire that neither Netanyahu nor Hamas seems to want. The Israeli leaders bet that for all its reservations, the Biden administration will remain the guarantor of the Jewish state's security seems to have paid off. The US and its allies helped repel a massive Iranian missile and drone attack against Israel in the month of April. The strikes followed an Israeli strike that the US did not know about in advance on an Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus that killed 8 senior IRGC officers. And so far, Biden, who has long prided himself on being one of the most pro-Israeli politicians in American history, has been reluctant to use the leverage that he has, such as permanently cutting off US military supplies for Israel, a step that would, of course, have huge political reverberations ahead of the US presidential election and leave Biden accused of deserting an ally fighting terror. A conundrum that Netanyahu has clearly taken advantage of. The question now is, what happens in the Middle East next? And could the US get dragged into yet another war?